Hi, everyone.
Hi.
We're finally on.
Yes, they're saying it's the joys of COVID-19, right?
So you figure, you spend so much time getting at Zoom, and now you gotta
I know, learn a new platform.
completely. All right, we're finally in.
Okay, so let's begin. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the session this morning on applied machine learning in healthcare, practical and legal considerations. My name is Rosario Cartagena. I'm Chief Privacy and Legal Officer at ICES. I'm your moderator this morning. I'm pleased to say we have two fantastic speakers this morning. So first is Dr. Mohammed Mamdani. He is Vice President of Data Science and Advanced Analytics at Unity Health Toronto. His team bridges advanced analytics, machine learning with clinical and management decision-making to improve patient outcomes and hospital efficiency. He has appointments at the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto, the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy, Dalla Lana Faculty of Public Health, as well as Vector Institute and ICES. Our second speaker, Mary Jane Dykeman, is partner and co-founder at Inc. Data Law. Her practice focuses on privacy, data governance, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence. She is a long-standing health lawyer and has developed Ontario's health privacy legislation. She also teaches mental health law in Osgoode and Health Law LLM program. They have a much more extensive bio, which I welcome you to take a look at following the presentation this morning. And as we begin, just to kind of preface and say that we will begin with Dr. Mohammed, who's going to introduce a case study demonstrating how his team has applied machine learning in healthcare. Following, Mary Jane will advance the practical and legal considerations in Ontario, as well as touch upon the federal government's recommendations for reform. And then we hope to leave approximately 10 minutes for questions following the presentation. So I'm very pleased to welcome them both this morning. And so, Dr. Mamdani, to share your slides, you're going to have to press, do you see at the bottom the screen with the, great, excellent. Okay, I'll let you take it away then.
We're there. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I apologize for the delay. You figured you'd learn Zoom and you'd know how to use every other platform, but we're finally in. So we're going to be talking about applied machine learning in healthcare. And I know there's a lot of hype around machine learning and AI in healthcare, and we really see very few applications. But when we actually go and apply these sorts of technologies, we kind of then say, whoa, there's a lot of other issues we just didn't really kind of think about or need to think about a little bit more. So I'm going to walk you through a bit of a case. The case is centered around a 73-year-old retired nurse. And by the way, this is actually a real case at St. Michael's Hospital. She came in with an inflamed gallbladder, cholecystitis, that's the technical term. And she was admitted to the internal medicine unit. Had a diagnostic procedure done, something called an ERCP, or endoscopic retrograde cholangiopancreatography. Planned for discharge home the next day. So, pretty routine. The physician was called at 6:30 p.m. and Miss RW had shortness of breath, and the physician ordered a chest x-ray and labs. Vital signs were checked twice overnight at midnight and 6 a.m. the next day. And the physician was called at 8:30 a.m. the next day for decreased blood pressure, distress, and the patient was transferred to a step-up unit, and the critical care response team was called. The patient was deteriorating. Now, the patient did not want to be admitted to the ICU, and she died in step-up that day. The family was understandably distraught at the sudden deterioration. And they really never really would have left her bedside if they had known as she was suffering. So the reality is 1 in 12 patients in internal medicine will die in the hospital. And the question is, what can be done? Because this sort of a situation is not that uncommon. A patient crashes, we didn't quite expect it. And by the time we realize they're in trouble, it's really a bit late to do anything meaningful. What could have been done if we had known earlier? Well, we could have increased monitoring, considered antibiotics. This could have been a sepsis or an infection. Called the critical care response team earlier or prepped them to just pay attention to this patient. Palliative care, if we knew this patient was going to die and there wasn't that much we could do with it, at least there's something there that we could be doing with the family and the patient to prepare them for the inevitable. And simply communicate. The amount of stress and distress that families and patients have not knowing what's happening or what's going to happen can be overwhelming. So of course, we could have intervened quite early had we known. At our hospital, our internist had come to our data science team and had said, can we predict who will die so we can intervene earlier? And that's essentially what we did. So at St. Michael's Hospital, we've had this up and running for a few months now. If you're in our internal medicine unit, you will be monitored by AI. All of our internal medicine patients are being monitored by artificial intelligence. We've created an algorithm that ingests data every hour on over 100 variables: labs, medications, orders, vitals. It considers 500 to 800 different permutations and combinations. And it actually then predicts death or need to be transferred to the ICU at least 24 hours in advance. Now, we've compared this algorithm to over 3,000 clinician predictions. So we've asked doctors, nurses, residents, what do you think? And we know that this algorithm does at least 20% better than clinician predictions, and it's over 99% accurate at Unity Health Toronto. What's been our experience? Our experience has been actually quite positive. In just a few months, we've already identified numerous cases that have been missed, and rightly so. They've been actually pretty tough cases, but the algorithm has caught them. We have these biweekly meetings, and at our last meeting, we were reviewing 3 occult infections behind the chest wall that were picked up. We have a nice little anecdote, for example. One of our clinicians had sent this to us. The resident on call overnight received a high-risk alert around 11 p.m. She went and reviewed the chart and saw the patient as per the recommended protocol. He was relatively stable, so didn't think much of it. But approximately 2 hours later, she received a call from the nurse that the patient was decompensating. As she already knew the patient, she was able to quickly assess at the bedside and get the ICU team involved. The patient went to the ICU, but did not, thankfully, have a respiratory effect, which was certainly a risk if the intervention had not been done as quickly. So again, the gains are there, and we all want what's best for our patients. But how do we get there? And what are the sorts of things that are actually practical considerations here? Well, fortunately, at our hospital, we actually have a pretty nice data environment that we've created for the purposes of developing AI solutions, machine learning solutions, and we've hired a pretty good data science team. So the data science team has access to data and all sorts of tools to create these solutions that I think fundamentally help our patients. The questions that come about, though, is there sufficient high quality data? What if we're developing algorithms that aren't developed very well on ideal lab data that don't really translate very well? They could actually hurt our patients, not help them. Who gets access to the data? I can tell you with a lot of data science teams, a lot of different hospitals, they have a tough time getting access to data. Is the data de-identified or identified? Well, if we're going to have an algorithm that predicts Mr. Jones is going to die in the next 48 hours, we need to know it's Mr. Jones and be able to tell Mr. Jones and the doctors who are caring for Mr. Jones. So it's silly to have de-identified data. We need identified data. And of course, what level of de-identification? And I would argue for some of these teams, fully identified. Now, when we actually go around the development, other questions come about in terms of who develops the AI. Is it just the data scientists? That would be a really bad idea. Is it just the clinicians? Also a really bad idea. It needs to be a whole team that's multidisciplinary, who understand each other. Also, are patients involved? And in our case, patients were involved. They should be, because they receive the care, or their care will be altered as a function of this algorithm. How has the algorithm been tested? What's the performance? Because if it kind of flags too much and has a high false positive rate, your clinicians are not going to use it. But if it's not very accurate, and your clinicians actually do better than the algorithm, and you're asking them to listen to the algorithm, you're harming patients. It's not going to help them. So what's that threshold? And what are the implications there for practice and potentially risk? How do we safeguard the system or model failure? We need to keep monitoring the model because sometimes models fail. And how do we know that they're failing? Then, of course, there's deployment. How's the information communicated? In our case, it's a red, yellow, green type system, low, medium, high risk, because human factors tells us that's the best way to communicate to people, at least one of the best ways. But there are many other ways to communicate. Have staff been educated? Who gets the information? And our patients have told us, if you alter the care that I receive, I want to know. So the patient should know, as well as the clinicians. What if action isn't taken? The algorithm says this patient's going to not do so well. The clinician says, maybe the algorithm's wrong, and then the patient doesn't do well. What's the risk there? And how do we minimize that risk? These are all sorts of considerations that we had to go through when we were developing our algorithm, and these aren't very easy questions. And of course, I have the easy job of presenting the case. I'm going to hand it over now to Mary Jane, who has a much more difficult job of going through all of these issues and the legal and ethical considerations around them. And Mary Jane, should I keep my slides up, or would you like to put your...
Just, I think mine tried to go over yours.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it actually won't pick it up. If you have it, let's do that.
Yeah, why don't I put up the slides then, and you can just carry on.
I'll ask you to forward. Perfect, thanks. It also would not let me unmute in that minute.
Oh no, okay. Here we go. Just let me know when you need me to move.
Okay, so we'll go forward. So I just want to take it from there. And these are not areas that we need to dissect, but I just wanted to pull this particular information about the given applications of AI in healthcare, because really what Mohammed is telling us is that there is such potential. And this is why it's absolutely exciting to be working in this area and to see what is possible for patient care, what's possible for improving the system, and where both meet. But if we're going to do that in any of these, and there are likely to be others, we're working across hospitals and in some other sectors, sorting out, well, what are the use cases? How do we know? If you could advance that, Mohammed, we'll just take a quick look. I guess the next question is, what are the guardrails? And as privacy people and lawyers, we are forever thinking about how we can do these things. Now, you may argue that some lawyers and privacy types are looking to slow it down, or some of you may even say that they are looking to impede, but ultimately we do have to deal with the legislation that exists. Is it enough? Does it give us any guidance? And for many years now, we've had lots of rules about data and compliance, but not anything really specific to this emerging machine learning AI environment. So let's just go forward to where some would say the barrier exists. So what about health privacy in Ontario? You've got PHIPA, Personal Health Information Protection Act, and I was part of the group that developed that at the ministry back in the day. And that's a good 20 years. I can say with confidence, we were not drafting PHIPA thinking about machine learning and AI and the electronic forms of information and what protections needed to be in place. So really, I don't want to go clause by clause by any stretch, but just to apply it to the situation. And Mohammed said, will you be using personal health information, which is inherently identifiable and therefore attracts a lot more protections, or is it going to be de-identified? Lots more attention now on the times when you truly need PHI, personal health information, and the cases where perhaps you don't, but we want to create repositories. We want to create the means to teach the systems and move on to the solutions. What kinds of activities are we talking about? Because that may change the landscape in terms of the rules. Is it for healthcare? Is it research? Is it quality? And all I've done in those few bullets is just point in very quick detail. Well, when we sit down with a statute, or Mohammed or someone comes to me and says, what can we do? Well, we just need to figure out what's the data, what's the quality of the data, who wants to use it, what kind of legal authority are we seeking? So express consent is possible. It can be applied only if for healthcare in PHIPA. Some will create research projects and apply the AI systems there, because there's at least an opportunity to convince a research ethics board that they should waive consent if it would be impractical to get it. And just a note about what TCPS2 requires. Under PHIPA, there's an opportunity to disclose for quality improvement purposes, but I would suggest that that was a late addition to PHIPA 5 years after it was enacted. It exists, not many people know about it, but the trigger to get in and use that clause is that you have to have the same patient going from one custodian to another. So it doesn't work very often. And then there's also an opportunity to get prescribed status, which I won't go into in great detail, but Rosario being at ICES is well familiar. There are different ways. It can be a cumbersome process. So none of these are perfect solutions, none of them exactly drafted for the environment that we're in right now. All right, maybe we'll move ahead to the next piece. We often, if you could advance that, Mohammed, that would be great. Mm-hmm. It's funny, when I started to draft these few slides and this group was having this discussion, actually we'll go back up just one.
Okay.
We were really talking about the absence of guardrails from a legal point of view. We know that there are 84 or more ethical frameworks that have been developed around the globe. Inc. Data Law is watching those very carefully, but it's not as though we had legislation to come to. We had PHIPAA and people saying we want to harness the data, we want to liberate the data, what can we do? And somewhat agonizing to tuck it into that. But a new development, and you'll see that it's happening so very quickly this week. There's been lots of talk about modernizing PIPEDA, the federal legislation, and here's what we have. This Digital Charter Implementation Act has just been put out. It is not enforced. We don't know what it will look like ultimately, but it does a couple of quick things. The Consumer Privacy Protection Act, CPPA, creates some protections. It speaks very specifically to automated decision-making, the need for transparency, explainability, and really it starts to come down to harms and what harms are we trying to avoid if an automated system starts to make a decision on behalf of a person, what does the person get to know, et cetera. There's some new enforcement powers for the commissioner. They're just worth noting that I think they exceed GDPR, the European statute that you've all seen in passing. And it cuts down, it's not PIPEDA anymore, it'll be EDA, the Electronic Documents Act. So the PIPEDA type provisions get wrapped into this consumer privacy legislation, but the main thing today is that there are rules coming in terms of AI and algorithms. Now, here's the catch. We still, for some of us attending today, are in Ontario. And as you know, the different provinces have different legislation. And if they've been designated as being substantially similar to the federal legislation, they have to go with the act that occupies the field. And for us, that's PHIPAA. So I just flagged, I wonder with these developments, if this CPPA comes into force as it is right now, what does it mean in terms of PHIPAA being modernized so that it can keep its designation of substantial similarity? I just wanted to raise this because, again, we've said for quite some time, in the absence of guardrails legally, what is it that we need to do? And this has come up. So the next slide really is just about a paper released on Friday from the federal commissioner, just in advance of the Digital Charter Implementation Act. And it's just worth a quick look. And one of the takeaways was let's not just focus on the technology, let's talk about the privacy impact on individuals of those technologies, and also create certain rights in relation to automated decision-making. This is a significant step because it's really the first time in Canada, and I can say globally, again, we monitor, and this is not moving anywhere as quickly as the technology itself. Okay, one last comment. The next slide, please. Right, so in terms of what have we done in the meantime, this is just a nod to some work that we've been doing in terms of not just looking at the ethical components, but an automated AI legal risk assessment, and not just bringing forward the negative components. I'm a hospital lawyer by training, and having been in-house and continuing to do the types of presentations to a board. What does a board want to know? What do we need to talk about within the organization in a cross-functional way to move and advance AI? We're just trying to think of how do we do that in a bundled way with a clear picture and visual of where are the positive impacts, where are the negative impacts, again, that could impact your reputation. What does it say about our regulatory compliance, about the end user experience, et cetera. So we've gathered some of that in order to be able to take a use case, run it through, and see how we do. And it's based on the federal government's algorithm impact assessment, and sort of a knitting it backward from there. So maybe we'll leave it there. I know that people may have some questions, but this is an exciting time. It's on the move.
Thank you, Mohammed and Mary Jane. I agree with you. It is a very exciting time. And maybe I'll just dive into some of the questions that are being posed in the chat. So the first question has to do with the concept of data minimization being a foundational principle in privacy laws around the world. And so how are you, Dr. Mamdani, obtaining enough data to train the models for AI? And Mary Jane, when it comes to artificial intelligence, you need volumes and volumes of data in order to ensure that your algorithm is at the best quality it possibly can to predict the information that you needed, the work you needed to do. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, maybe I can start with the data. So at St. Michael's Hospital, this is where the tool that I just chatted about was implemented. It took a bit of time to develop, and it was trained on over 20,000 patients worth of data. Historically, we have data going back 12 years, and typically we get 25,000 inpatients visits plus per year. You can imagine the incredible amount of data per patient. So you multiply that by 20,000. There are billions and billions of data points to work with. Lots of data.
And I would simply add, it's so critical to do the hard work in terms of data government. I don't even know that it's hard work. It's just something that needs to be done. It's imperative, because my take is there's so many organizations that hold so much data. Again, do we know where all of it is? Many teaching hospitals, for example, could have 50 or more systems, legacy systems, and we need to first find the data. That's the opportunity even in and of itself. Once we know that, then we can check on its quality and we can start to think about, well, what would we like to do with the data? In fact, that process is underway for some, but I think some organizations are dodging it a little and looking around, not dodging it in a negative way, but just worried about the de-identification piece and the risk assessment that goes into that, or can we use personal health information? So there are some elements that really need to move. The data exists. In terms of where do we get it, I think in many cases it's there, and then we're also seeing some groups wanting to create repositories, even of de-identified information, to open it up, to advance it. But we need to get to the data to do that.
Right. And so on that note, I see a question that has been asked. And so it says, you stress the need for data to be identifiable for the application. Would you say it's true for end users, health professionals, patients, that's the case, but that data should be de-identified for model training and development? What would you say is the right balance in terms of the use of that data?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in fact, we had a couple of research teams come in and students come in, and they were working on de-identified data. Absolutely. So for training and development purposes, a lot of times you don't need the identified data. Our team, though, we're kind of straddle both the application and development aspects of things. So we tend to have identified data. It's also when you want to troubleshoot, it's again, depending on what you do, it's important to have access to identified data, because you hear from the clinicians, well, Mr. Jones or his X had issues, and then how do you go back and track that data and figure out what happened to Mr. Jones as cases? But for the routine research development, the bulk of it, no, absolutely, de-identified data is probably what should be used, and that's what we have done in the past.
Terrific. And in terms of practical considerations, so I see a question here on the chat, and it has to do with the process of interacting with, clinicians, nurses, and staff, and so forth. And so the question is, with very busy, St. Mike's Unity Health is very busy. So how long does it take to get their feedback, or how do you go about ensuring that the relationship management of the algorithm and the clinician happens in a way, that makes sense for the operations and for bedside care?
Yeah, the model that we have is a bit different in that we will not take on a project if the clinicians don't have time for it. So we don't, it's more the clinicians working with us than us working with the clinicians. They have to actually be vested. They have to put in the time. So we often are very frank and say, if you cannot attend biweekly meetings for an hour for the next 3 to 6 months and have a lot of work done in between, if you don't own and drive this project, we will not take it on.
Yeah.
So that it has to be their project because they want to change, not us driving it.
That makes perfect sense. And Mary Jane, with the new proposed legislation, do you think there's going to be any impact on private-public collaborations when it comes to AI? Do you think that's going to be included in any of the discussions, or do you think it's going to be agnostic in terms of, you know, who are the players?
Well, again, we have only a slight disconnect in that you've got a provincial statute and rules, and we have to sort out the substantial similarities. So to my mind, we've got to bring PHIPA up to that status so that it can continue. And really, if you consider what's in the Digital Charter Implementation Act and this CPPA, I would have thought it is to drive innovation. I think it was the Federal Privacy Commissioner who also made comments about something to the effect of harnessing data for good, the social good element. So it has moved in a very good direction, in my opinion. And I do think that it will apply across the board just in terms of the endeavors. So any private sector group that doesn't fit under provincial legislation is likely to partner because much of the health data is sitting in the public sector in Canada. So I think there's been a push already, but this development really does open the door for more of those discussions, and not just discussions, action.
That's right. And I know we're a few minutes over time, but maybe if you could, you know, close off by saying one thing that, you know, if you could predict what's going to happen in the next couple of years when it comes to AI and healthcare and practical and legal considerations, what would be a take home that you would give, you know, the audience here? Maybe we'll start first with you, Dr. Mamdani.
Sure. You know, I guess the one takeaway would be AI is coming and this is a team sport. So you've got to work with clinicians, with data scientists, with lawyers, and people who have expertise in ethics and privacy. That's the only way we're going to advance the field.
Second, Mary Jane?
Well, I'll stick with the sports analogy. We've got to do that off-season training. So that's where we are right now, but we're looking ahead. AI and machine learning have such tremendous potential. The legal and privacy aspects, the ethical aspects, I'm very confident they can be addressed, and we need to. We have to be diligent about it, but we cannot stop. That would be a disservice to all of the people, patients like the one that Mohammed mentioned. So let's go.
Terrific, great. Thank you both for the terrific presentation. I see lots of questions in the chat. I'm not sure what the next steps are for addressing those questions, but maybe I'll follow up with the Toronto Machine Learning Summit and have a better sense of that. And thank you to all our guests for attending this morning as well. And have a terrific rest of the day.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.